Hello, my name is Scott Neigh, and today I'm going to be talking about books. So a few days ago, I posted a video to the channel, a kind of new introduction for the channel, to talk a little bit about the fact that I'm coming back to playing around with video and hopefully posting some videos on a semi-regular basis over the next little while, mostly because I'm kind of bored with some of the other larger projects that I'm involved with at the moment. And I said that one of the kinds of videos that I wanted to make were booktube style videos. And this is the first one of those. This is what in booktube convention is called a wrap-up. So it's going to be me talking about the books that I've read in October and giving sort of a mini review of each of those books. And in October, I read 5 books, which is about par for the course for me. What's maybe a little unusual is that of those 5, 4 of them were fiction and 1 was nonfiction. Usually I read a bit higher proportion of nonfiction than that. But just to jump right into it, the first one that I finished was Things to Do When You're Goth in the Country and Other Stories by Chavisa Woods. So this is a collection of dark literary short stories. They're all set in the United States, often in areas and with characters that don't have a lot of hope. They're often economically bleak areas. They're often quite rural settings that they're in. And like I said, they're literary kinds of short stories. They all do have, or many of them have, fantastical elements sprinkled in. I found them to be, on the whole, pretty good. They were quite inventive. The writing was pretty good. There were a few of them that felt like they were maybe trying too hard. I often find that with literary fiction that adds a magical element. It often feels like it's trying a little bit too hard to do something, whatever that something might be. But I thought on the whole, these were good. And if that's the kind of fiction that you like to read, definitely worth picking up. And I particularly thought that it was effective in capturing a mood that I think is, a reasonable mood to want to be writing about in this particular fairly politically bleak moment. The second book that I read was The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. This is the one nonfiction work that I finished this month. It's a scholarly work published in, I believe, 2010. Maybe it was 2012. That is has quickly become a classic in terms of other studies of mass incarceration in the United States and a kind of a Bible for the movement organizing against mass incarceration. And it is a tremendously important book, tremendously important. And I think why it felt so important to me is, I don't live in the United States. I live in Canada, so it's not necessarily something that I'm going to be reading about on a regular basis, although it's very hard to read kind of progressive news and analysis in Canada without reading mostly stuff that's about the United States. So I have, over the last 20 years, encountered lots of bits and pieces about the system that has come together to produce mass incarceration. I remember reading articles in Z Magazine in the 1990s about things like asset forfeiture and the struggles around that. But I'd never encountered something that laid out so carefully and methodically and effectively how the system of mass incarceration works. It talks about various court decisions, various ways that resources are allocated, various ways that political decisions get made, making very clear how they, in many ways, were each very contingent kinds of decisions responding to specific pressures in that moment, not necessarily with a larger political vision in mind, but over the course of from the early 80s to, I don't know, sometime in the 90s maybe, and it's become more entrenched in various ways since then, it became a coherent and cohesive system that targets working class and poor communities of color in various ways, resulting in many, particularly young black men and women and gender nonconforming and trans people as well, being locked up and tagged with criminal records and so on. And like I said, this is a tremendously important book, and I think certainly everyone interested in understanding the way that society works in the United States should read it, and I think there's value to folks who are in Canada reading it as well, even though the way that anti-blackness and the way that the carceral state work in the Canadian context is distinct in certain ways, but it's still worth reading. The third book that I read was Kissing the Witch, Old Tales in New Skins by Emma Donoghue. So this is a quite short collection of fairy tale retellings that center women. And Emma Donoghue is a quite well-known Irish author, I think. I hadn't heard of her before I encountered this book, but from what I understand, she's written quite a lot. I liked this book, but I didn't like it quite as much as I was hoping to. So the fairy tale retellings are very much in the same spirit and the same tone and the same kind of voice as traditional fairy tales. They're connected together quite cleverly. There's a kind of a linking page where the narrator and protagonist of one asks the narrator and protagonist of the next to tell her story, and so on down the road. And I think the capturing of the rhythm and voice of fairy tales is quite effective. I thought in general the stories were good. There were a few that I thought were really, really good. But like I said, I didn't like it quite as much as I had hoped, and I think, I mean, it may be a problem with my reading less than the writing. I felt that even though each one was a different story with a different narrator, a different protagonist, some of them did feel like they blended in one to the next, and there were times where it was kind of difficult to keep the stories separate in my mind after I'd read them and as I was reading them. Again, that might be a problem with my reading more than the writing, but maybe it would have been possible to make the voice more distinctive from one to the next. I don't know. If you like fairy tale retellings, definitely check it out. Like I said, it's most of them are quite good, and some of the stories are really excellent. The fourth book that I read, and I think my favorite of the fiction that I read this month, is Akata Witch by Neigh Okorafor. So this is a YA fantasy. The protagonist is a Nigerian-American girl whose family moves back to Nigeria when she's about 9 years old. And the story starts a few years after that. And in some ways, it's using a classic model of fantasy story aimed at youth, where she discovers that even though it seems at the start she lives in the world that we live in, she discovers that there's actually a hidden world underneath of magic, magical powers, magical creatures, all of those kinds of things. And she discovers that she herself is capable of performing magic. So the story is her relationships with other young people who are able to do magic, of her discovering her powers, and of course, as these things go, of her being instrumental in defeating a particular evil in this moment and extending, I presume, into the sequels after this. It's a really, really great book. The world building is incredibly inventive. The storytelling is great. It just moves you along, a really great rhythm. The characters are engaging and they feel real. And I particularly appreciated the ways in which the author both deploys and plays with the conventions of the young person discovers that magic exists and they have powers genre of books. I thought that was really, really clever, the way that she did that. So I would recommend everyone who likes fantasy check this out. And the final book that I read in October, that I finished in October, I guess, was A Great and Terrible Beauty by Libba Bray. I wasn't a huge fan of this book, although it's kind of a complicated response because there were things that I thought the book did really well. I've read one other book by Libba Bray. I read Going Bovine a few years ago, and I didn't particularly like that, but I encountered a review of A Great and Terrible Beauty that made me think maybe this would be more what I felt like reading in that moment. But like I said, there were definitely some strong points to the book, but I had a lot of concerns as well. So part of it is just that it's just not the book for me. I don't like 19th century English novels to begin with. And this is a young adult historical fantasy set in mostly the 19th century in the UK. And it is written in a way that tries to sound like a 19th century English novel. So even though it was quite good at doing that in many places, I don't really like that kind of writing anyway. So that didn't work so well for me. And there were other places where I thought there were actual problems with the writing that weren't just my reaction to them. I thought there were points where the ways that characters reacted, the ways that attention was directed, the ways that things were described were in kind of a subtle way torqued towards 21st century readers rather than the ways in which 19th century characters would react or pay attention or speak about things. That may be unfair. I'm certainly not an expert, but it seemed to me there were instances where that was happening. And there also seemed to be instances where, you know how in writing, a really good illustrative detail can really make a scene or a sentence or a paragraph. There were moments where it really felt like it was a kind of a case of insert generic Victorian reference here. And therefore those details were not always as effective as they need to be for powerful writing. And the most troubling thing for me, and I have to admit this may have colored the way that I read the rest of the book, was the first two scenes. So most of the book, as I said, was set in the UK, but there were the two chapters at the start that were set in colonial India. And I just found those really troubling to read. They were written, as is the entire book, from the perspective of a young, privileged white English girl. There was nothing really in how they were written that would provide the kinds of resources that I think a North American 21st century reader who doesn't really know anything about the British Empire to sort of read that in a critical way, in a way that would produce a critical reading of the colonial situation. So, it just read as like a very Orientalist kind of way of describing the situation. Again, I'm not an expert. There are probably other readings of that, but that was certainly how I experienced it. And I think that did kind of taint my reading of the rest of the book. All of that said, the book does lots of good things as well. I thought the relationships between the protagonist and her friends were quite well done. Some of them were friendships, some of them were frenemyships, and that was really, really smartly done. I thought that the ways in which the book dealt with their explorations of magic and kind of related that to both the sort of the seduction of power, but also to them chafing against the strictures of young women of their particular class in the late 19th century, and their sort of sexual awakenings, their desires for particular kinds of lives for themselves. I thought that was generally pretty well done. It was a little heavy-handed in moments, but mostly I quite appreciated it. And I thought the strongest thing about the book was actually the ending. Not necessarily the decision about sort of the final plot points, but the last part of the book. I thought the writing was stronger in the last part of the book. I thought the story really came together. I thought it drew me in a way in the last 50 or 100 pages in a way that it just hadn't earlier in the book. So not really my thing. Not necessarily something I would recommend, but also in a strange way, it's not impossible I might pick up the sequel at some point if I'm in exactly the right mood and it happens to be at hand. So there you go. That is my first attempt at a wrap-up video. I believe the convention at this point is to say please click like and subscribe, and I hope I will be back again soon with another video.